You're a stain on this family. Madeline's voice sliced through the elegant dinner table like a dagger, her finger aimed at Sade. The black woman engaged to her billionaire brother. The room went silent. But what no one at that table realized was that Sade had recorded every word. This wasn't just a dinner. It was the moment everything changed. Behind the luxury and wealth of the Whitmore estate, Sade faced not just cruel prejudice, but a calculated plan to ruin her. What dark motive fueled Madeline's outburst? And how will Sadie, armed with the truth, turn this moment of humiliation into her greatest power? Hit subscribe to follow more gripping stories like this and share in the comments where you're watching from. Don't blink, because the twist waiting at the end will leave you speechless. The sun spilled gold through the glass ceiling of the Solera Convention Center, bouncing off crystal name tags and expensive watches as real estate investors from across the country moved in curated waves. In a corner booth, flanked by a digital rendering of an eco-luxury hotel project in Ghana, Sade Okonjo stood in a structured white blazer, her presence calm but commanding. She wasn't just another CEO with an impressive pitch. She was the architect of a hotel brand redefining Black excellence in hospitality. Investors leaned in when she spoke, not just because of her numbers, though those were flawless, but because she held the room with a quiet confidence sharpened by survival, vision, and a kind of grace no Ivy League education could teach. She had just wrapped up a presentation to a group of venture partners when she felt the weight of another gaze, one that didn't come with a business card. Across the floor, Julian Whitmore was watching her, tall, poised, the type of man whose wealth followed him into a room like a scent, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't the loudest presence in the space, but he was the one people kept glancing at, partly because his last name sat on the signage of half the commercial towers in the city. When their eyes met, it wasn't sparks or fate. It was something quieter, heavier, like two tectonic plates recognizing one another before a shift. Julian introduced himself during a panel coffee break, not with arrogance, but with curiosity. He'd been watching her company's expansion quietly for months, he admitted, and was intrigued by how she had captured the mid-tier luxury market with a culturally immersive experience. Most men in his position opened with a compliment or a condescending suggestion. Julian opened with strategy. That, she noted silently, was different. They spoke for 20 minutes and forgot there was a crowd. She was cautious. Black women in rooms like this couldn't afford to be anything else. But something in his questions made her linger longer than she intended. What followed wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a measured build. They met at fundraisers and panels, then privately over dinner, again in cities neither of them lived in, between flights and obligations. Julian wasn't performative, and he didn't treat her success like a novelty. Instead, he dissected her models, asked about long-term scaling, and listened when she shared frustrations about being underestimated. And when he spoke about his own family's legacy, decades of land holdings, commercial properties, philanthropic ventures, he did so without the inherited entitlement she was used to confronting in wealthy men. Still, Sade kept her guard up. Her heart didn't belong in rooms built to exclude women like her. It wasn't until 9 months in, during a site visit to her New Orleans property, that he asked her to marry him. It was early by most standards, but not theirs. They had both lived lives where time was currency, and neither was interested in wasting it on pretense. He didn't offer a rehearsed speech or staged proposal. Instead, he looked her in the eye and said, "I don't want a future that doesn't have your name in it." She said yes, not because it was romantic, though it was, but because for the first time, the future didn't look like something she'd have to survive. It looked like something she could shape. The announcement of their engagement rippled through their respective circles with the speed and tone of quiet skepticism. Sade's friends were thrilled but wary, well aware of the politics of marrying into old money. Julian's network, particularly his family, responded with smiles stretched too wide and silences that felt staged. Still, she didn't flinch. She wasn't marrying into wealth. She was marrying into partnership, or so she believed. The first official family gathering came a month later, a private luncheon at the Whitmore estate, reserved for intimates. The word itself felt like a test. She arrived wearing an ivory sheath dress and low heels, her locks pinned neatly into a crown. The Whitmore estate was everything the tabloids had said. Sprawling, historic, painfully tasteful. There were oil portraits older than her lineage, and a butler who pronounced her name too slowly, like it was unfamiliar terrain. Madeline Whitmore, the older sister, was the first to greet her, flanked by their mother Eleanor. Madeline was the sort of woman who led foundations and committees, who never raised her voice but always got the last word. Her handshake was firm, her smile tighter. The lunch went smoothly on the surface. There was champagne, cold seafood, and talk of international markets. Said offered a story about a recent hospitality partnership in Nairobi, which was met with nods and a comment from Madeline about how refreshing it was to see representation in travel these days. Julian noticed the undercurrent, but didn't interject. His father, Gregory, remained affable but disengaged, asking about the weather in Atlanta instead of Said's business. When the conversation shifted toward family traditions, Said excused herself to the powder room, where she exhaled for the first time in an hour. She didn't cry. She didn't fume. She simply looked in the mirror and reminded herself that she didn't get this far by needing approval. She had been in rooms colder than this, with gatekeepers crueler than Madeline. What made this moment sting wasn't the condescension. It was the betrayal of her expectations. She had allowed herself to hope that competence would be enough, that love would buy her a seat at the table. But competence threatened power, and love wasn't a currency this family seemed to understand. Back at the table, dessert was being served when Madeline asked about her intentions regarding long-term integration into family stewardship. It wasn't a question. It was a coded inquiry. Said smiled politely and gave a textbook answer about collaborative growth, but her mind was already racing. She could see the game being played. Slow disqualification under the guise of polite civility. And what she knew better than anything else was that the most dangerous battles weren't fought in public. They were decided in rooms like this, over crystal glasses and couched insults. That night, as Julian walked her to the car, he kissed her hand and asked if she was okay. She said yes, but the words sat between them like a lie they had agreed not to challenge. At least not yet. The second invitation arrived not by email or text, but by hand-delivered envelope, crested with the Whitmore family seal and embossed in gold. Inside, a cream-colored card extended an invitation to a formal family dinner at the estate, in honor of the newly engaged couple. There was no RSVP required, only the unspoken understanding that presence was mandatory. Said stared at the note for a long moment, recognizing it not as a welcome, but a summons. She had stepped into a world where power was performed through gestures. This subtle, no direct attacks, just carefully placed obligations masquerading as grace. Julian, ever hopeful, assured her it would be different this time. "They just need more time with you," he offered, as if proximity had ever cured prejudice. Said didn't argue, but she began preparing for war in the only way she knew how, with evidence, with clarity, and with armor made of poise. Her dress for the evening was elegant but unignorable. A deep emerald green satin gown with structured shoulders and gold accents that shimmered when she moved. It said, without a word, that she knew exactly who she was and that she didn't come to blend in. The Whitmore dining room was a curated display of generational wealth: long mahogany table, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of ancestors who had died owning entire neighborhoods. As she entered, the room quieted momentarily, not in awe, but in calculation. She could feel the silent appraisal ripple across the guests, who were all carefully selected members of the Whitmore inner circle. Most were white, affluent, and dressed as though elegance were inherited, not earned. Madeline stood at the far end of the room in a champagne gown, looking every bit the hostess and gatekeeper, with a smile that curled but didn't reach her eyes. Dinner began with a prayer, followed by wine and whispers. Conversation tiptoed around market forecasts and foundation gala themes. When Said was asked about her hotel expansion in South Africa, her answer was met with overly bright nods and a half-murmured, "How lovely," from Madeline. Each compliment carried the weight of patronization. Eleanor, Julian's mother, asked if she found it challenging to maintain elegance while expanding abroad, as if refinement was incompatible with ambition. Julian noticed the sting. but again chose silence, his hand grazing Sade's thigh in quiet apology under the table, as if his touch could absorb the tension. The first open strike came over dessert. The waiter had just set down almond cake with raspberry glaze when Meline tilted her head and asked, "Sadie, I've heard you submitted a grant proposal to the Whitmore Foundation. I do hope you understand how competitive our review process is." Her voice was smooth, but there was venom beneath it. Sade held her gaze and responded with grace, confirming that she had submitted a full proposal months ago, complete with audited reports and community impact data. "Yes, I'm quite familiar with competitive reviews," she added, her voice calm but edged. Medeline's smile hardened. "It's just that, when family's involved, we must be especially cautious. It sets a precedent, you understand." The table quieted. Forks hovered midair. It was a performance masked as policy, but it wasn't lost on anyone that this wasn't about fairness. It was about control. Julian stiffened beside her, but said nothing. Sade's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the slow, rising clarity that this wasn't mere resistance. It was sabotage dressed in etiquette. She met Medeline's eyes again and said, "Of course, I wouldn't want to be accused of having unfair advantages, especially by people so invested in preserving fairness." The dig landed, and for a moment, Medeline's composure faltered. But before the moment could settle, she leaned forward, eyes sharp, and said, "Some of us are just more protective of the family legacy, especially when outsiders with ambitious goals start circling." That word, outsiders, rang out like a shot. It wasn't about marriage or funding anymore. It was about race, about class, about bloodlines. The message was clear. Sade could be admired from afar, but she would never be allowed to rewrite the narrative from within. She was tolerated, but never truly welcome. Julian's chair scraped the floor as he shifted beside her, but still he said nothing. And in that silence, Sade realized that love alone was not going to shield her. She would need proof. That night, as they drove home, she remained quiet, her fingers scrolling through the voice memo app on her phone. She had recorded the entire evening, every comment, every coded insult. She didn't plan on using it yet, but she knew she would need it. Julian sensed her detachment and tried again to offer comfort. "She'll come around," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sade turned to him, her tone flat. "She's not circling me, Julian. She's circling the foundation, and I'm standing in the way." He didn't reply. His silence wasn't malicious. It was inherited, learned from generations of men told that keeping the peace was nobler than confronting the storm. But Sadie hadn't built her empire by staying quiet. She had fought too long to hand her future over to a family more invested in appearances than truth. And now, with the dinner's recording saved and her instincts sharpened, she knew what she was up against. This wasn't going to be a story about a woman breaking into a powerful family. It was going to be a reckoning. And Sade had just entered the lion's den. Only she wasn't prey. The morning after the dinner, Sade awoke before sunrise, the taste of almond cake still bitter in her mouth. Julian lay beside her, breathing softly, unaware that the woman he loved had spent most of the night rewatching moments in her head like surveillance footage. Each raised eyebrow, every half smile, all the polished cruelty wrapped in civility. It lived rent-free in her mind now. The recording sat secure in her phone, but the true evidence was carved into her memory, not as wounds, but as warnings. She had been weighed, measured, and subtly marked as a threat by people who would never say so outright. Despite the emotional hangover, business did not pause for aristocratic discomfort. That afternoon, she had a virtual call scheduled with a family foundation in Chicago, one of several she'd contacted months ago to co-fund the expansion of her Nairobi property. The call started smoothly until a senior administrator mentioned, in passing, that her application had been flagged with concerns. "It's standard," the woman said, tone overly casual. "We cross-reference risks flagged by other grant networks, especially from reputable sources like the Whitmore Foundation." Sade's blood ran cold. She hadn't applied under her married name. The only link was the Whitmore network. When the call ended, she stared at the blank screen, her hands clenched in her lap. There had been no formal rejection, but the damage was clear. Someone, somewhere, had started a whisper campaign. And in a world where reputation moved faster than truth, whispers were often louder than facts. She reached out to Elena, a contact from a different philanthropic trust. What started as a simple favor spiraled quickly into a revelation. Said's name had circulated on a soft blacklist shared between several elite foundations, flagged under vague claims of questionable financial sustainability and potential conflicts of interest tied to marital ties. The source of the memo? Victoria Madeline Whitmore. It was dated 3 months before the dinner. Said sat frozen, the screen burning white in her palm. Her mind looped back to the way Madeline had spoken at the table, so effortlessly false, as if she hadn't already sent knives flying long before dessert. This wasn't caution, it was sabotage. With a calm that frightened even herself, Saudi asked Elena to send her a copy of the memo. Within minutes, the document landed in her inbox. Formal letterhead, Madeline's signature, carefully worded slander disguised as strategic caution. It read like an obituary for a business that hadn't failed, because someone was trying to kill it first. That evening, she waited until Julian returned home. He entered the penthouse with his usual ease, his tie loosened, holding 2 coffees as a peace offering. He sensed something was off the moment he saw her, but didn't speak right away. Said placed the printed memo in front of him without a word. He scanned it, slowly at first, then again faster, his face draining of color as comprehension set in. He muttered that it couldn't be real, that it had to be a misunderstanding, but the foundation seal and his sister's looping signature offered no escape. For a long time, neither of them spoke. When he finally looked up, his expression held something new, not just guilt, but recognition. "I didn't know," he said softly, "but I believe you." It was not enough, and he knew it. Said remained composed, but something had shifted in her eyes. Julian tried to defend Madeline, calling it a mistake, a precaution taken out of context. But Said cut through the spin with the precision of someone who'd survived enough gaslighting to see it coming in advance. "She didn't question me, she condemned me, and she didn't even have the decency to say it to my face." Julian's defense collapsed. He slumped into the chair beside her, the reality settling like ash. She wanted to rage, to scream, to demand why he hadn't warned her, why he hadn't protected her. But deeper than that was a quiet ache she couldn't voice. She had believed, foolishly, that merit could shield her, that being excellent would be enough to override old money's fear of disruption. She realized now that no amount of success could make her immune to the insecurities of a woman who'd been raised to believe power should never be shared. For the next several days, the silence between them was not cold but contemplative. Julian wasn't the enemy, but he was the product of the system trying to break her. And he was beginning, finally, to see the cracks. He hired an investigator on her behalf, promising to dig deeper into the extent of Madeline's interference. Said didn't object, but she no longer waited for his help to move forward. She began collecting more evidence: emails, meeting minutes, informal calls with Foundation insiders. The damage was deeper than she'd feared, but not irreversible. Her reputation had not been ruined. It had been ambushed. The tension finally spilled over the day the investigator delivered a folder full of internal emails and voice logs. Madeline had not only written the memo, but had personally called multiple Foundation directors, warning them against Said by name. She referred to her as a risky investment cloaked in charm, and a social maneuverer leveraging romantic proximity for financial advantage. The language was clinical, polished, and devastatingly deliberate. Julian listened to the recordings with shaking hands, horror mounting with each sentence. When one call ended with Madeline laughing softly and saying, "She's impressive, yes, but not one of us," he stood up and left the room. Said didn't follow him. She sat still, letting the moment burn itself into her bones. There was a difference between being excluded and being erased. What Madeline had done wasn't just personal, it was professional assassination, disguised as family stewardship. But this time, she wasn't going to retreat. She wasn't going to explain herself, beg for space at a table never built for her. She had the proof now. And with proof came power. What she chose to do with it would determine everything. As night fell over the city skyline, Said looked out from the balcony of their penthouse, the folder resting on her lap. Below, the lights blinked like constellations, a silent audience to what would come next. She had always believed in strategy over emotion, in facts over fury. But now, with the truth in her hands and the scars beneath her skin still fresh, she realized that sometimes the only way to dismantle a fortress was from within, and she had just found the cracks. By the time Sad stepped into the glossy marble lobby of the Whitmore Foundation's downtown headquarters, she already knew the decor would scream permanence. The walls, lined with awards, historic photographs, and curated displays of family philanthropy, were less about charity and more about legacy. Legacy was what the Whitmores worshipped, what Meline guarded. The elevator ride to the top floor felt slower than usual, as if the building itself was savoring her arrival. Sad's heels echoed with intention, not defiance, though the difference was razor-thin now. The purpose of her visit wasn't confrontation. It was a presentation. Officially, she was there to deliver supplemental documentation to her long-delayed grant application. An innocuous excuse, but in reality, she wanted to be seen. To walk into Meline's sanctuary, not as the fiancée, not as the social guest, but as the woman whose business had survived a private assassination attempt. Dressed in tailored navy and gold, she looked every bit the power player she was. But beneath the surface, the air was electric with calculation. She was no longer asking to be included. She was marking territory. Meline greeted her with a smile so polished it could have been forged. Her assistant had barely finished announcing Said's arrival before the director emerged from her office, arms open in a performance of warmth. They exchanged pleasantries, the room thick with unsaid things. Said handed over her folder, unlabeled, minimalist, heavy, and watched as Meline flipped through it, eyes darting without absorbing. "We'll take this into consideration," she said, her tone saccharine. Said simply nodded. "I trust your review will be as thorough as ever." It was a quiet challenge, veiled in courtesy, but she saw the flicker in Meline's eyes. They both knew what game was being played. What Meline didn't know, however, was that Said had already begun to dismantle her silent sabotage. She had spent the past week gathering testimonials from former board members, clients, and foundation insiders. Some had left the Whitmore orbit willingly, others had been pushed out, but all of them had stories. Stories of misallocated funds, internal bias, and Meline's subtle gatekeeping, especially when it came to women of color applying for funding. One former grant advisor recalled how Meline had once rejected a proposal from a Black-led housing nonprofit, citing a lack of cultural alignment. It hadn't made it into the paperwork, but the message was loud and clear. Armed with receipts, Said began weaving her case like a prosecutor, never with emotion, always with precision. She didn't move against the foundation publicly, not yet. Instead, she quietly shared her evidence with allies in the business press, whispered into the ears of influential donors, and fed the growing discomfort that had begun to rise around the foundation's lack of transparency. She didn't scream. She stirred. It was a whisper war, elegant, slow, and devastating. And Meline, still drunk on her certainty, didn't feel the noose tightening around her until it was too late to untie. Julian, once caught between loyalty and disbelief, had begun to change. The recordings, the emails, the memos, they didn't just expose his sister's prejudice, they shattered the illusion that their family's wealth had been built on anything pure. His conversations with Sad grew quieter but deeper. He began asking questions, not about her, but about the systems he'd inherited, systems that had rewarded silence, protected mediocrity, and punished difference. For the first time, he wasn't just her fiancé. He was a man unlearning the myths of his bloodline. It terrified him, but it also set him free. Meanwhile, Meline doubled down. Sensing that control was slipping, she made herself more visible, giving interviews, spearheading new campaigns, even floating rumors that Sad's business was expanding too fast to remain stable. It was a subtle smear, masked as concern. But every public move she made only deepened her exposure. Said had anticipated it. She had created a digital archive documenting each falsehood, each contradiction. The more Meline spoke, the more she validated Said's evidence. The invisible knife she had once wielded so expertly now glinted under the light. One particularly damning moment came when a leaked audio clip surfaced from a board meeting in which Meline claimed that emotional business models often rely too heavily on identity rather than structure. She hadn't named Said outright, but the context was unmistakable. The audio reached a journalist at a prominent financial magazine, and while no article had been published yet, calls began flooding into the foundation's donor office. When Eleanor Whitmore, the family matriarch, summoned Julian for a private lunch, it wasn't to inquire about his engagement. It was to ask what exactly Said was planning. Said didn't respond directly to the noise. She continued building. Her Nairobi hotel launched a soft opening with rave early reviews. Her team began preparing for a European market debut. And behind the scenes, she and Julian were already in early talks about launching their philanthropic initiative, one not beholden to family bloodlines or whispered legacies. It wasn't retaliation, it was evolution. She had learned that fighting for space at someone else's table was far less effective than building your own. Still, Meline was not finished. Days before the next family gathering, a private dinner meant to formally welcome Said into the family, an anonymous email landed in several foundation inboxes. It included a manipulated spreadsheet suggesting that Said's company had falsified expenses. It didn't take long to trace it back to a former associate linked to Meline's social network. The attack was desperate and sloppy, and this time Julian saw it for what it was. Not protection, not protocol, just prejudice, cloaked in strategy. The night before the dinner, Said stood in their kitchen, stirring tea she wouldn't drink, her mind rehearsing the conversation that would inevitably come. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even angry anymore. She had walked through fire and come out flame-proof. What haunted her now wasn't what Meline had done. It was how many people like her had suffered in silence for decades, without evidence, without allies, without a voice. That was why she wouldn't stay quiet. Not for her, for them. Tomorrow she would sit at that family table again. But this time, she wouldn't bring a smile or a pitch. She would bring the truth. The night of the dinner arrived cloaked in quiet tension, the kind that couldn't be seen but was deeply felt. The Whitmore estate glowed like a palace, its windows warm with golden light and its gravel driveway lined with black town cars. But beneath the elegance was a silence that hummed like a storm waiting to break. Said stepped out of the car, her posture composed, her emerald gown flowing like armor. Her expression revealed nothing, but in her clutch was the device she'd prepared for this moment. The recording was cued. The truth was ready. Inside, the family had already gathered, 12 seats filled with carefully dressed people who had inherited more than money. They had inherited assumptions, expectations, and unspoken rules about who belonged. Said walked in with Julian by her side, his presence steady but his eyes scanning the room as if searching for cracks in its perfect facade. Meline stood at the far end of the table, greeting guests like a queen at court, her voice sweet, her smile sharp. When she saw Said, her gaze didn't falter, but it hardened just slightly like steel behind lace. "Welcome, Said," she said, her tone gracious, public, and performative. "I hear your little hotel venture is still keeping you busy." The word little wasn't lost on anyone. It floated above the table like a veiled slap. Said smiled, not because it was funny, but because she had learned that sometimes power came from responding with silence, stronger than their words. "Busy enough," she replied evenly, "and about to get much busier." They took their seats, and the courses began. Salads plated like artwork, wine poured by white-gloved servers. Conversations bubbled around market forecasts, charity galas, and property acquisitions. But under the surface, eyes flicked toward Saad, waiting for the moment they sensed was coming. The room carried that unmistakable air. The family thought this dinner would be a show of unity, or worse, an unspoken warning. They didn't realize it would become a reckoning. When dessert was served, almond cake again, ironic in its repetition, Sade folded her napkin slowly, placed it beside her plate, and cleared her throat gently. "Before we finish, I'd like to thank everyone for the warm hospitality," she said, voice calm but clear. "And I'd like to express how much I've appreciated the chance to be part of this family's traditions." She paused, her eyes moving across each face. "But tonight, I'm going to return the gesture, with some traditions of my own. I believe in transparency." Meline's smile faltered, her spoon pausing midair. "Of course, dear," she said, voice still smooth but now edged with something uncertain. "What are you referring to?" Sade reached into her bag, lifted her phone, and gently set it on the table. "This." One tap, and the audio began to play. First came her voice, recorded during the foundation meeting, the part where Meline had dismissed her grant proposal with barely concealed disdain. Then the emails, then the memo, then the phone call, Madeline's voice unmistakable, warning other foundations not to trust Sade's motives or business acumen. The table fell into stunned silence. No one moved. Even the clink of cutlery stopped. Madeline's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly, standing abruptly. "This is a violation. You've taken things out of context. You've misunderstood my role." Her voice wavered, not from fear, but from the realization that her performance no longer held the room. Sade looked at her, steady and unshaken. "You didn't misunderstand me, Meline. You made sure others did." Then she turned to the rest of the family, who sat frozen in place. "For 3 years, I've listened to passive slights and polite doubt. I've worked to be excellent, not just for myself, but so I couldn't be dismissed as a mistake. Still, it wasn't enough, not because of anything I did, but because of what I represent." Julian stood beside her then, not as a defense, but as solidarity. "This ends tonight," he said. "This family does not get to protect its image at the expense of her dignity." Meline looked at him, stunned. "You'd take her side over your own family?" Julian answered, voice firm. "She is my family now, and the only disgrace here is how you've used your power." The moment stretched, 10, maybe 20 seconds, but it carried the weight of generations. Sade turned to the rest of the table one last time. "I don't need your approval. I came here hoping for unity, but I leave with clarity, and sometimes that's even more valuable." She placed the napkin gently back on her plate, stood tall, and walked out of the room, not in anger, but in control. Behind her, chairs scraped. Voices rose, but she didn't look back. The night didn't end when Sad left the dinner table. It simply shifted arenas. Behind her, the once curated harmony of the Whitmore household dissolved into low arguments and slammed doors. But she didn't stay to watch the unraveling. Instead, she stepped into the car waiting in the driveway, her phone still in her hand, the recording app quietly blinking red. She hadn't needed to play it all, just enough to make the silence unbearable. Back at the penthouse, she peeled off the emerald dress, hung it carefully back on its padded hanger, and sat by the window. Below, the city moved as it always did, unapologetically, indifferently, a reflection of the world she'd always known. The spotlight may have finally turned toward the truth, but that didn't guarantee justice. That required action. That required witnesses who were ready to do more than whisper. The fallout began the next morning, swift and unrelenting. Her inbox was flooded. Some emails from foundations she had previously applied to, now expressing renewed interest in supporting her vision. Others were more guarded, seeking clarification, or simply trying to gauge where public perception was heading. The media hadn't picked up the story, not yet, but the inner circle of power players had already begun passing it around like a scandal with legs. In elite circles, the truth traveled fastest in silence. Julian returned home just after noon. His tie was gone, his shirt half unbuttoned, his expression unusually quiet. He looked at Sade with a weight she hadn't seen before. Not guilt, but a burden shared for the first time. "They called an emergency board session," he said. "Meline was asked to step away from any grant-related decisions until further review. The trustees want a formal audit of the last 3 years." It wasn't an apology. It was accountability, or the beginning of it. Sade didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, then asked him what he planned to do next. Not as her fiancé, but as a Whitmore. He hesitated for just a beat before saying, "I told them I'd cooperate with the audit, and that if there was any attempt to spin this against you, I'd walk away from the foundation entirely." It was the line she had been waiting for. Not a grand gesture, not a rescue, but a choice. And for once, it was the right one. But outside their walls, not everyone was ready to let go of old narratives. A respected society blog posted an anonymous rumor suggesting Sade had strategically recorded the family for personal gain. Another columnist hinted she was too ambitious too fast. Sade read each headline without flinching. This was expected. In the absence of control, those who had once defined the story would always try to rewrite it. But this time, she had her voice and proof. She released a quiet but powerful statement through her company's official channels. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't defensive. It simply laid out facts, her achievements, the documented timeline of events, the audio excerpts that had triggered internal reviews. She didn't call anyone out by name. She didn't need to. The tone was calm, but unmistakably firm. She was not a symbol. She was a leader, and she would not allow her reputation or her work to be twisted into someone else's cautionary tale. The next day, Julian's mother reached out. It wasn't a warm call, but it wasn't cold either. She expressed regret, not for what had been done, but for what had been allowed. "I should have paid more attention," she admitted. "Sometimes tradition teaches us to overlook the wrong things." Sade accepted the words, but not the absolution. She hadn't spoken her truth to be pitied. She had spoken it to be heard. Meanwhile, Meline remained unusually quiet. The board had temporarily suspended her foundation authority, and whispers circulated that some of the family's largest donors were reevaluating their commitments. Her usual appearances on panels and interviews were suddenly canceled, and several close allies distanced themselves, citing the need to wait for the full picture. It wasn't a downfall, not yet, but the structure she had built around her name was beginning to tilt. But Sade wasn't waiting for collapse. She was building something else. In the days that followed, she and Julian formally announced the launch of a new initiative, a startup incubator focused on women entrepreneurs from underserved communities. It wasn't about revenge, it was about redirection. The first investment came from a global tech partner who had previously passed on her. Now their email read differently. "We should have supported this vision earlier. We'd like to correct that." For the first time in weeks, Sade allowed herself a moment of quiet joy. Not triumph. Just a breath. Deep and uninterrupted. She wasn't healed, but she was whole. She never responded to Meline directly. No final confrontation. No apology requested or offered. Instead, she simply moved forward. Louder, stronger, visible on her terms. Some bridges don't burn with rage. Some just grow cold and unused until they collapse under their weight. By the end of the week, Julian stood with her in their office as they reviewed proposals for their first incubator cohort. He turned to her and said, "You changed more than just the narrative. You changed the power." She looked at him, steady and sure. Not changed, reclaimed. After the silence had been shattered, Sade didn't retreat. She recalibrated. The confrontation at the dinner had not been an ending. It was the lighting of a match. But fires, if they are to be effective, must be fed carefully. And so, in the days that followed, she stepped away from the noise and into strategy. Her voice had spoken truth, but now it was time for truth to take form, measured, documented, and undeniable. Julian's support was constant, but quiet. He had stepped away from the foundation's operations temporarily, pending the audit. In that space, Sade began building something new, not only for herself, but for others who had been sidelined quietly for far too long. She gathered her legal team, her business advisors, and a private investigator Julian had once worked with. The goal wasn't vengeance, it was transparency. If patterns existed, they needed to be revealed, not whispered about in private, but held up to the light. As the days passed, evidence surfaced: emails, reports, internal memos, and recordings. They painted a clear picture. Funding decisions within the foundation had, in some cases, been filtered through personal bias rather than merit. In particular, any application connected to Sade, or any cause that challenged traditional lines, had been quietly pushed aside or labeled high risk. It wasn't just about Sade anymore. It had happened to others too. Each finding strengthened Sade's resolve. She knew that no public statement would carry weight without substance. This wasn't about emotion. It was about credibility. She spent long hours with her team, cataloging everything, preparing timelines, and anonymizing third-party cases where needed. She wasn't just preparing to speak. She was preparing to set a new standard. Meanwhile, invitations to the Whitmore Foundation's annual gala were circulating. It was the largest event of the year, hundreds of donors, partners, and leaders under one chandeliered ceiling. This year, for the first time, Sade and Julian had planned not to attend. But now the gala presented something else. A stage, not for revenge, but for truth told, professionally, and without apology. Julian was hesitant at first. "Are you sure?" he asked. "We could keep pushing this through the board quietly." But Sade knew better. Quiet fixes only repaired the surface. "Something," she replied, "need to be seen to be understood." 3 days before the gala, they informed the board that they would be attending, not just as guests, but as speakers. As the founding family, Julian had the right to speak. As a leader whose name had been misrepresented, Sade had earned the voice. That same day, news began to circulate. A few subtle leaks to select reporters, statements of fact, not opinion, ensured that attention would be on the event. Not scandalous, not dramatic, just enough to make people curious. And curiosity, Sad knew, could lead people to finally listen. The night before the gala, she stood before her closet, not to impress, but to declare. She chose a deep crimson gown, elegant and powerful, with structured shoulders and minimal accessories. It wasn't a costume, it was a reminder. She belonged wherever she chose to be. While reviewing the speech with Julian, they made one final change. It was subtle, but important. The message wasn't just about the foundation or the betrayal. It was about who gets to write the story, who gets to be seen, and how silence left unchecked becomes complicity. As they finalized the file, Julian looked at her, not as someone to protect, but as someone to follow. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "we lead with truth." And Sadie nodded, her voice calm but steady. "We're not burning it down," she said. "We're clearing the way." The Whitmore Foundation Gala was always the grandest event on the city's social calendar. A night of crystal chandeliers, silent auctions, and carefully curated speeches designed to keep legacy polished and donors generous. But this year, there was a different undercurrent. Whispers had begun days before, speculation drifting from boardrooms to ballroom seating charts. Sade and Julian were attending, and not just attending, they had something to say. The venue shimmered with opulence as over 300 guests filled the hall, each dressed in their best version of power. Sade entered in a deep crimson gown that turned heads for its simplicity, not extravagance. She didn't need to outshine anyone. Her presence, calm and poised, spoke louder than the diamonds on display. Julian walked beside her, his posture upright, his expression unreadable. At the far end of the room, Meline stood radiant as always, greeting guests like royalty. But when her eyes met Sade's, her smile faltered. The evening unfolded like any other. Drinks, laughter, performances. But tension lingered beneath every exchange. Everyone knew something was coming. What they didn't know was how public it would be. Midway through the evening, the host called Julian to the stage. As a founding member, his presence wasn't unusual, but his tone, steady and grave, made the room quiet before he even began. He spoke first of the foundation's mission, supporting ethical entrepreneurship, investing in community innovation. Then he paused. "Tonight," he said, "I want to address something personal, because silence only protects the wrong things." All eyes turned to him, but many slowly shifted towards Saad. He described without naming names how an internal pattern of biased decision-making had come to light, one that undermined the foundation's very purpose. He spoke of proposals rejected not for lack of merit, but due to personal interference. He detailed how reputations had been damaged through unverified internal memos, how applicants were discouraged without transparency or fairness. The room had gone still. Whispers halted. Wine glasses were held midair. Then Julian invited Sad to the stage. She didn't rush, didn't fumble. Her heels echoed across the floor like a metronome, counting down to truth. When she turned to face the audience, she didn't posture. She simply told her story, calmly, factually, from her business's track record to the denied grant, to the statements made behind closed doors. She never raised her voice, but every sentence landed like a stone on water, quiet at first, then rippling through the room. When she played the brief audio excerpt, a recorded moment from a board meeting where certain voices questioned her suitability, based on personal relationships. Gasps were audible. Said didn't offer commentary. The recording spoke for itself. Julian returned to her side holding a folder. He shared that the board had already convened and reviewed the findings. Effective immediately, the foundation would undergo leadership restructuring, and the individual responsible would step down to preserve the integrity of its mission. Across the room, Madeline's composed posture wavered. Her mouth moved as if to interject, but the moment was no longer hers. It belonged to the truth. The crowd responded not with applause but with solemn nods, many realizing that complicity had worn the mask of tradition for far too long. Others began to whisper not about scandal, but about correction, about reform. When the couple stepped off stage, they weren't swarmed, they were watched. Not with pity, not with suspicion, but with the kind of consideration rarely afforded to those who challenge the system from inside its walls. Meline left early, not escorted, not disgraced publicly, but her absence was noted, her silence louder than any defense. In the days that followed, articles emerged, not gossip, but features on accountability, leadership ethics, and the role of legacy institutions in perpetuating bias. Said didn't grant interviews. She didn't need to. Her actions had spoken. More importantly, the foundation's structure shifted. A new board was formed with external advisors, new grant review panels, and open auditing. The policies changed, and with them, the culture slowly began to evolve. Said didn't celebrate. She worked. Her startup incubator, now backed by several major investors, launched quietly a month later. The first round of selected founders included women from cities and backgrounds often overlooked. She met each of them personally. Julian, once a bystander to his family's patterns, became a deliberate ally, not by speaking for Said, but by standing beside her and following her lead. They weren't just a couple, they were builders of something better. And though Madeline's influence faded, she remained distant, sending only a short letter months later. It didn't contain an apology, just a line. "I see now what I refused to." Said never responded. Some acknowledgments, when they come too late, are better left unopened. The storm had passed, but the echoes of what had been revealed still lingered in the air. Some scandals fade quietly, buried beneath the next headline or the comfort of denial. But this wasn't one of them. What happened at the gala didn't simply shake a family's foundation. It forced a legacy to reckon with its reflection. For Saad, the days after were not filled with celebration, but clarity. There were no press tours or public displays of victory. Her win hadn't been about applause. It had been about restoring her dignity and clearing the path not only for herself, but for those who would come after her. That was the true measure of justice. Not just a reaction, but a reset. Julian moved quickly to finalize changes within the Whitmore Foundation. The new board included professionals from diverse backgrounds, and the grant selection process was rewritten from the ground up. Policies were no longer reviewed behind closed doors. They were transparent, published, and open to challenge. For the first time, the foundation reflected the values it claimed to represent. Said did not return to the foundation's orbit. She chose instead to focus on the initiative she and Julian had quietly been building, an independent fund designed to support entrepreneurs from marginalized communities. It wasn't just charity, it was an investment. She believed in building structures that lasted, that could grow without apology, that weren't at the mercy of legacy politics. The fund launched with 5 entrepreneurs, each of them chosen not for their stories, but for their strategy, their brilliance, and their potential. Said met with them individually, offering not just capital, but mentorship. She knew what it meant to walk into a room where you were underestimated. She was determined that they would never feel that alone. One of them, a young woman from Detroit named Amara, had reminded her of herself, sharp, focused, and quietly defiant. Watching her pitch to a room of skeptical investors and win them over without raising her voice gave Said a moment of quiet pride. It wasn't about revenge. It was about replication, about planting seeds that no one could uproot. As for Meline, her silence became her undoing. In the absence of accountability, her name slowly disappeared from the foundation's archives and influence. She had been given a chance to explain, to rebuild. She chose pride over peace, and in doing so, she stepped away from relevance. There was no official exile, just distance, and distance, when it grows quietly, becomes permanent. One afternoon, months later, a handwritten letter arrived at Said's office. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, deliberate. It wasn't long. No apology, no justification. Just 6 words. You were right, I wasn't ready. Said folded it once and placed it in a drawer. She didn't need closure. She had already built something more lasting. She and Julian had grown stronger in the silence between the storms. Their relationship, once shaped by compromises and quiet sacrifices, was now rooted in active choice. He had learned that neutrality was never truly neutral, and Sadie had stopped making herself smaller to keep peace. They didn't need perfection. They had respect. Their home felt different now, not because of its walls or decor, but because of the certainty inside it. Sade no longer questioned if she belonged in that world. She had created her own. In time, the story of what happened at the gala became less about scandal and more about a shift. Other foundations reached out, asking to learn from the changes made. A quiet wave of reform began to ripple. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to matter. One evening, at a small gathering of young entrepreneurs, a woman approached Sad with hesitant eyes and a voice that trembled with gratitude. "I watched your story," she said. "I almost gave up, but then I saw you didn't." Sade smiled, not for praise but for promise. "Then don't," she replied. Years from now, no one may remember the names tied to a single family feud, but someone will remember the first time they saw a woman stand tall at a table that tried to shrink her. Someone will remember the fund that believed in them before the rest of the world did. Someone will remember that justice isn't always loud, but it is always earned. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you of your journey, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay true, stay bold, and never forget, you deserve a seat at any table or the power to build your own. See you in the next story.